Rob, I'm getting carried away here. I think you ought to make sure I don't go on too long. I've got a lot of really... Oh no, you're kidding. May I have your permission to go on a little bit longer? I haven't got to the point yet. Oh no, much more than that. Well, look, I'll negotiate. I'm going to have a lot of eye contact with Rob, and I shall do terrible things to him if he interrupts me. I want to get on to something which is really, really important. Actually, the whole point of this is still to come. I really do tell you, but oh dear. Well, how much can I cut out of what I'm going to say? I'm now going to say, let us suppose that owing to the oil peak, and owing to action on climate change, and owing to all the straws in the wind I began by talking about, that our entire intermediate economy crashes. And we don't have any intermediate goods any longer. And that we're looking towards that diagram picture on the right with these Hopkins-led rural economies, relocalized economies, the process of relocalization. And we are trying to live in an economy in which the intermediate economy doesn't work any longer. What would we do? Well, I'm not going to take you through that entire list, but actually are one or two elements on the list which might be worth taking you through, if that's all right. Supposing the first thing is social security systems. As you may, I'm sure you remember, 31% of government expenditure on social security systems. So in one's localized economy, one has a lot of unemployed people, one has a lot of old people, and they need social security systems, but the government has no money with which to pay them, and one needs to provide for these people oneself. Well, that's trouble. And I'm not saying that all there are easy solutions to any of these. One has to take the trouble on the chin as well as the solutions. Poor law is one of the long term. Another ground base in English history has been the poor laws, and there's been always a contest between villages, between rural economies to get rid of their poor and to shove them on to the next parish. And Queen Elizabeth had trouble, and there was trouble before, and there's been trouble ever since. However, there are some things one needs to look at the bright side, and the purpose of my talk this evening is to cheer you all up. One recognize that there are lots of things going in our favour. That is to say, the villages will be much, much more located. People will be living at home. People will be living at home. There would be probably more extended families. The cost of living will be much lower. There will be quite a lot that one can do for the unemployed and for one's elderly relations. So there are some things that can be done in the context of social security. What about health? What do we do about that if there you are in your rural economy? Well, there are some good things one could say about that too. Quite a lot of things in our favour. One thing one's not likely to have is a lot of obesity. So that will save some trouble. And probably there will be no junk food. One's diet to be a lot better. We'll be back to diets like the Robert McClance and with the Widdowson diet of the war, which is the best and most healthy diet that's been in modern times. You may very well find the degenerative diseases, the cancer and the arthritis and the osteoporosis and the coronary disease. They wouldn't disappear by any means, but they would probably be much less prevalent than they have been. There would be less. The cost of health would be reduced. So there would in fact be people would be taking more exercise. People would probably be smoking less. I would imagine be hard to get tobacco under those circumstances. There is no such thing as a society so poor that it can't afford to produce its own alcohol out of potatoes or something even worse. So I can't necessarily say that alcohol would be sorted, but if Rob Hopkins was in control, I can imagine that people would be, ways would be found of preventing people getting drunk. So there are ways that, but also the other thing one has to say is that social capital would be very much developed. And one of the things which is very, very good for one's health is having friends. If you're well connected with friends, with friends and family, your chance of dying over the next 5 years is reduced by between half and 5 times. 5 times less likely to die over the next 5 years if you've got lots of friends and families around. And if you haven't got any friends and family, but you decide to join a group of some kind, your chance of dying over the next 1 year is reduced by half. So we'd be a highly sort of socialized society, and that would help to keep us healthy. So there may well be much less disease. So that would be something in our favor. There'd be other things in our favor too. One thing we would not have would be delocalized hospitals. There would have to be localized hospitals. There'd be no way of getting to Exeter, the nearest hospital, if that is your nearest hospital. There would have to be local hospitals. There would probably be fewer specialism. There would be, at long last, a recovery, a serious encouragement of voluntarism. There would be voluntary help in hospitals, as there used to be in the past, and will be again, and there isn't now. And there would be hope that it is possible to run small local schools and produce absolutely spectacular consequences, results in education, reading and music and art and thought and constructiveness and niceness, that nice quality that nice people can have and many people don't. It can be done in local school. If you think of the other things that communities can do, one, they can teach the art, they can teach farming, they can teach masonry. They used to teach how to make a wagon. Well, I will actually quickly say, I mean, that the teaching of crafts in community is the most spectacular thing, and I would recommend, if anybody hasn't read it, you read George Sturt's The Wheelwright Shop, and it describes, for one thing, the most wonderful thing about how they make wheels, and the men who have to drive the spokes into a hub. It's like they're sort of the Barenboims of carpentry. There would be the hub, and there were these spokes, and they would pick up this sledgehammer, and then with a leap, hit this spoke right in the middle, and it would stay there for the next 200 years. And it would be impossible to teach anybody that unless they start at the age of 12. And here's Gordon Brown saying they ought to keep them at school until 18. So the things that communities can do, which are fundamental. I'm now cutting out a lot of really good stuff, and it's your fault, guys, right? Oh, there's just one more thing I want to say on education. I'm going to leave other things I was going to say on community education, but there is something to say about higher education. I mean, are we talking about a future in which there's no higher education any longer? Well, it would be a pity if that did happen. But you know, as a Conservative minister said under the Thatcher government not all that long ago, we have taken money from the people who write about ancient Egyptian scripts and about the prenuptial habits of the upper Volta Valley in order to give them to technical education. Any society which has a Minister of Education that says that doesn't deserve to have any education system at all. It's like tickling a dog's stomach. They do not know what higher education is for. At the moment, we to a large extent don't have higher education. But there have been times in the past when higher education has been produced very, very successfully on very, very little money indeed, which is very, very local. For example, the Workers' Education Association started in the late 19th century, Albert Manbridge, had spectacular results. And I've got actually at home, I've got the archive of some of the education which happened in Horwich Literary Society. And Horwich is a very small engineering town, at least was a very small engineering town. They made the very famous Horwich tank engines and steam locomotives, and they had the Literary Society met on Tuesdays and Thursdays in the Railway Mechanics Institute. And Mr. David Gibson was the manager of the Horwich Loco Works, and he was also a very, very good tenor. I used to sing to them on Tuesdays. Other people sang too, it wasn't just him every Tuesday, I want to say, but nonetheless. And also there were lectures on Thursdays about various literary topics, and he was enthusiastic about Thomas Carlyle, and gave them a lecture on poetry, which, as lectures should do, makes a connection between what he's talking about and the locality. And I have a quote from him here. There we are. Poetry teaches us to see beauty all around us. We see it in Horwich, we see it in the windswept streets, with the old smoke-blackened houses with their decent fronts on a clear east windy day. We see it when we look down on the Black Rod and Horwich Valley with its houses and factories, the gleams of water in the lodges. We may even find this beauty and the poetic interpretation of it in some of our big stately locomotives. Well, if I heard that lecture and that enthusiasm and that emotion and that passion and that connection in any modern university, English course in modern university, I'd be impressed. So there are things the localities can do on education. Defence, there are lots of things to say about defence, but under the eye of Rob, I'm going to leave defence on one side. It is the most difficult one anyway. On law and order, what does one do about law and order? Well, law and order was cracked to a large extent in the past. We tend to underestimate the accomplishment of the medieval Gothic civilization. One of the reasons we underestimate that is because it was purged, almost all evidence of it was purged in the Reformation, with the exception of the cathedrals, which should give us some idea about how effective it was. They didn't have a police force. Will we be able to afford a police force? The answer is no. Well, they couldn't then either. But they had an alternative. The Statute of Winchester in 1285 defined the police function of every male in the village. Every male had, from the age of 15 to 60, had to go around armed. The knights would have to wear a hauberk, which was a coat of mail and a sword. The poor men have a bow and arrow and a knife. When the church bell rang, they'd have to take part in the hue and cry. It was their responsibility to keep the road verges free of vegetation, of trees, so the robbers couldn't hide behind them. And they had to take part in something called a posse comitatus, where if the Scots or neighbours got seriously uppy, they had to go out and sort them out. We now use posse in the context of the drug gangs of Boston, Mass. So they did have an effect. They did have a police force. It worked. It was an amateur police force. As far as crime detection was concerned, that was more problematic. They didn't really know very much about it. Very hard to know who did something and imagine a terrible deed. And how do you get, and everybody's denying doing it. Well, they had something called compurgators, which is a jury that would get together to say who they thought done it. It wasn't very effective. They used to back this up with giving them tests, such as putting a pebble at the bottom of a boiling cauldron and getting someone to pick the pebble out. And if their blister was bad enough, then it showed they were guilty. Or grasping a red-hot iron, or walking over red-hot coals. One wouldn't necessarily recommend these procedures in localities. But we don't need to do so, because in many, many ways we actually are now becoming technologically capable of localization in a way no civilization has ever been able to do before. The fact that we're localized doesn't mean we don't have access to DNA technology. We don't have access to the modern detection techniques. It doesn't mean that we won't have an amateur police force capable of taking part in this. Indeed, we will do this. Suddenly, the citizen as an active participant in the society will become crucial again. All these things can be done. And the last thing I should say about that is that magistrates, we inherit their brilliant system of magistrates, which came after 1066, after the conquest. They existed informally for 300 years before they were finally established in the 14th century. And we had them a really thriving, wonderful system of magistrates, capable of perturbing the peace and of keeping the society in order, until about 10 years ago when the Labour government started dismantling it in its process of centralisation and delocalisation. There are still magistrates, and may even be magistrates here. But on the whole, they're being centralised towards large towns, and localities are losing control of their law and order. And they're being sort of taken over by the servants as stipendiary magistrates. So to a large extent, the magistracy is disappearing. That can be recovered. And then the last one we can look at is transport. In the case in the future, A, we won't be able to have transport because of the reason we discussed, and B, we will be developing local self-sufficiency. So will we need transport? No, we won't. Can one really imagine our road system being discarded, being abandoned? Well, indeed, it's happened twice before. The Roman road system was discarded. And then in 1837, we used to have the most wonderful transport system of the turnpikes, 20,000 miles of turnpikes, dual carriageway, 30 yards across. In 1842, they were empty, crucified by the railways. The grass started going across them. They never recovered. So there are things that can be done. Okay, right, now I'm going to get to the point of what I really want to say, which is, if we're going to do all this, we're really going to show that localization can work in practice. We need to build communities around which can make them work. And this is very, very difficult, but nobody is talking about this, and I find it very difficult myself to talk about, because it's just not in the vocabulary, not in the mind, it's not well planted there, because it's sort of new stuff, and I'm still very unfamiliar with it. I feel a little bit I was walking over hot coals. But a community is a group in a particular place. A community is a group in a particular place in which interactions and loyalties snake through the whole thing, like well tossed spaghetti. It's a grammar. It's a grammar of community. It's a common inheritance. It's a humour and good faith which identify a community and give it existence. Right, that's what community is. So, let us actually sort of see what happens, how this applies. Now, there are different sorts of community, and the depth of obligation depends absolutely on the size of the community. Deep obligations exist in very small groups, in families of 5 to 12 people. Less deep obligations, but nonetheless crucial ones, exist in the next scale size up, which is 150. That is the group, that is a society, the essential size of group which will need to work in the future as a cooperative unit. That ain't me speaking, that is a huge literature on the scale of a group which is large enough to be effective, but small enough actually to be cooperative. It's 150. However big the community should be, it should recognize that it's the groups of 150 that are the groups that matter. Above that, there are larger groups which can be more or less any size you want. One could call them the parish. And above that, there is a nation. And they all have different forms of reciprocity, whose names are so long, I better not tell you what they are, because I'd run out of time. But if one's going to do that, then one would need a culture. And one needs to recognize that culture is going to have a central job to do. Right. Well, culture is, I think the best thing is to give a metaphor. It's like the upright strands that you begin with when you're making a basket, round which you wind the texture of the basket itself. It actually is the culture which is the grammar. And a lot of the culture and a lot of the texture of the community which I'm talking about, in fact, is inherited. Much of the culture which works in a community building sense is not something which we do because we like to do it, but because we've inherited. And the person who explains this best is the philosopher Edmund Burke. And I'm going to read out to you what he said about it. Oh yes, I should have ended up with that. I was in such a hurry. Can I just go back to Ivan Illich on transport? Can I just forget about needing transport, concentrate on space? Ivan Illich said, what we need to think about is space that offers to each person a constantly renewed experience that the center of the world is a place where he stands, walks, and lives. You can't put it better than that, really. Anyway, what I really wanted to show you was Edmund Burke. Much the strongest moral obligations are such as were never the result of our option, wrote Burke in an appeal from the new to the old Whigs. Men without their choice derived benefits from that association. Without their choice, they are subjected to duties in consequence of these benefits. Without their choice, they enter into a virtual obligation as binding as any that is actual. So culture, to a very large extent, and the way the communities work, is to a very large extent something we inherit, and we have to actually hang on to everything we possibly can, all the cultural inheritance we have got. Okay, anyway, we know what culture is now, and now I'm going to coming to my concluding part of what I'm going to say. I'm actually getting to the point now, and let's actually say what culture does. What does culture actually do? Why do we need it? Well, it does three things. Thing number one is it provides social cohesion. That is to say, social cohesion is the difference between a group, a cooperative group, and a crowd of individuals that are indifferent to each other or actually hostile to each other. And that's really all one needs to say about cohesion, actually. Except that how is cohesion expressed? You don't say, here we are, all being jolly cohesive together. How it's actually expressed is it's in culture. Cohesion is expressed in music, in choirs, in going to choir practice, in doing things which are cultural together, which are not cloying together, which actually have cultural integrity and cultural accomplishment together. And the second thing that the culture does it develops a public sphere, and not many people talk about a public sphere either. And the public sphere is something which exists, which you take part in when you are expressing yourself in a community not as yourself. That is to say, you're no longer thinking about your problems and about why it is that your compost loo doesn't work, and about how difficult neighbours are, and what you'll do with the apples, and who is stealing your cabbages, and things like that, and generally the mechanics of how to cope. We're actually saying, okay, enough of all that, maybe we'll come back to that tomorrow, but let's now raise our thoughts to higher things. So, in the public sphere, that is to say, you are not just expressing yourself as you are, you're not being, in the modern sense, authentic. You're actually doing something, you're taking part in something which you know in the literature as self-distance. You're saying, don't look at me, don't think just about me. I'm not coming here as me, I'm coming here as a member of the community. And to some extent, in fact to a very large extent, that the absence of the public sphere is expressed in the modern age by the fact that people aren't dressing properly. I don't want to become moralistic and ranty about dress. That's not my purpose at all. But one of the reasons, in fact, the justification for when you go to parties as in Islington, as one does, every bloke looking as though he's a plumber, every woman looking as though she's brought a plumber. In some cases, they probably have. You never know. But clothes are sort of not the thing. The way to express oneself, the self-distance, is to do something really silly, like wear a bow tie, something with absolutely no practical value at all. It makes you look a little bit daft. The public expression requires something which is not of practical value. The public sphere has no direct practical value. It is direct as cultural expression. That's the first thing that happens in the public sphere. And I think it's actually worthwhile saying that there is a question of demoralization here. One of the reasons why the public sphere is no longer recognized, is no longer expressed, is because people have become demoralized. Who cares less? Nobody cares really about the public sphere any longer. What is the public sphere? Nobody has any idea. Maybe you have little idea what I'm talking about in terms of the public sphere. It's just not part of our experience. Young people would have no clue. But it's a matter of demoralization. That is what's happening. We no longer think we belong to a public sphere. It matters any longer. So when one's actually talking about relocalization, we're talking about remoralization as well. The two, relocalization and remoralization, are the same things. It's actually saying your locality matters, and it matters more than in practical terms, it matters in cultural terms as well. And in that context, it is possible to play. Play has been fundamental to every resilient, long-lasting civilization. These villages I was telling you about, which we need to recover if we're going to keep the DNA of human society going. They need to have a culture of play. I'm getting very near the end now. What does play do? Play is such a relief because it means you can get very, very close to somebody, and we will need to get very, very close to people in the community of the future. But if you get that close, it can be a little bit terrifying. You don't want to be all that close to people. And come on, that you can take these things too far. In the context of play, there's also distance. So you establish your difference and your separate identity in the context of play. And this is well recognized in the play literature. You get very close with people, and you agree to be adversarial with them. So you're establishing your difference, and at the same time you're colluding in this common activity. And that is a way of bonding. It's very hard to bond with anybody effectively without play. Without play, it just becomes sort of cloying or nasty, or you just fall apart. And it's also very good for your body because it releases serotonin. And if we deprive of serotonin, then you're likely to be involved in a drug addiction, violence, tantrums, withdrawal, depression and boredom. Sounds like everybody's idea of the teenager. Could be something to do with that. Maybe they lack serotonin. So, very near the end, promise. That's the second thing the public sphere does. And the third thing the public sphere does, it develops practice. And practice is an idea which was described by Alistair McIntyre, which is accomplishment in an artistic skill, such as playing the piano, or being very good at something very difficult. And I was talking about this yesterday, but some people will be familiar with what I'm about to say. However, Alistair McIntyre developed the idea that if you are very good at something like, let's say playing the piano, or whatever it may be. The three moral qualities are developed in you. Number one is truthfulness, because there's no possibility of you actually knowing, reaching a level of accomplishment without actually having some sense of truth or falsehood. You can judge your own performance. The second is fairness or justice. You can judge other people's performance. And the third is culture. The third is courage, because you're always slightly going beyond what you've ever done before. You're always testing your limits. And those three, if ever one wanted as a package of moral qualities, those are the three which one can package properly. Those are the three things which come from the public, from accomplishment. So that's what public sphere does. And now the last thing that culture does, which is then I will really stop talking, is that it develops something which may be the most fundamental thing of all, which is judgment. We're suffering from a depletion of oil, we're suffering from a depletion of many things, and above all, we're suffering from a depletion of good judgment. We seem to have lost the ability to think. We're digging the hole deeper and deeper with every public decision that's made, and probably bad judgment is spilling over into personal judgment as well. So the question is, how does culture develop judgment? Well, it develops it in the following way. Number one, it establishes your identity, because if you are accomplished in a culture, you take part in your community's culture, then that gives you the identity. And therefore, if you have an identity, you know what you're making a judgment about. If you don't have any identity, there is no way in which reason actually makes any sense at all. There are some areas of life, such as Euclidean geometry, in which a sort of free-ranging rationality exists, whether there's anybody around to know it or not. But actually, in most of the circumstances of our lives, we have to have an identity before reason makes any sense at all. And the illustration of that, you imagine an antelope being chased by a lion. The antelope's reason says, I need to run away from this lion. And the lion's reason says, I need to chase this antelope. And those reasons are both right, but they're all entirely based on, related to, founded on the identity of said antelope and lion. And it is actually becoming not rhetoric, is not hyperbole to say that in our society, in our failing society, we are losing our sense of identity to such an extent we are losing our ability to reason, because we don't know who we are any longer. The second thing, which is related to that, is that if you have established your identity by your involvement or participation in culture, you can actually get rid, you actually in command of your own identity. You don't have to prove anything. If you don't have to prove anything, you can come to a problem without any baggage. You don't have to come to every problem in order with a particular agenda. And you can take case-by-case judgments. And that, I'm glad to say, ladies and gentlemen, takes us back to that wonderful period. I don't want to exaggerate how wonderful it was. It had problems as well. It had good qualities as well. The medieval period in which they developed this property of making case-by-case judgments. And they made a lot out of it. It was just one of the few things that kept Christendom together, that there has to be with integrity of being able to, of not approaching things in a big catch-all scientific way, but actually looking at the person in the eye and saying exactly what are the circumstances that are going on here. That later came to be called casuistry. And needless to say, as science began to come on stream in the 17th century, it began to be rubbished. And Blaise Pascal rubbished it in his Lettres Provinciales in 1656, in a polemic of such absolute savagery that casuistry has been a term of abuse ever since. And from since then, philosophers have been earning an enormous amount of money, which is entirely undeserved, developing broad philosophical principles in terms of which to make that decision. So that's the third. My last, he's making the most fearful signs at me, for which he will suffer later. I have about 5 more sentences. Would you like to hear my last 5 sentences, then? You see, right. I hope I've explained to you why, if we're going to join together and make a future, the first thing we need to do is to go after choir practice. I kid you not, it's parody. It is the bit that's been forgotten about. It's the culture that comes first. Indeed, we do have to find ways of swapping vegetables and developing renewable energy systems and doing such very difficult things and making ourselves self-sufficient. And those things are very difficult and absolutely essential. They're non-negotiable. And thank goodness we are doing it. But that's not what it's about. What it's really about is starting now to build localities that ring with creative vitality and which we can call home. Thank you.
Thinking along the same lines as David Fleming is the writer and philosopher Sir Roger Scruton.
What is important for me about David Fleming is the wide range of his mind and the way in which he brings in the cultural, religious and literary and even musical inheritance of our civilization in order to cast light on what exactly we are. And I think that is terrific. A civilization that's simply devoted to material growth and the maximizing of consumption is doomed. Human beings don't only pursue and enlarge their appetites, but also constrain their appetites and constrain their sense of what is appropriate through being attached to things, attached to each other, and being attached to a place and the economy and the form of life that goes with it. And that's something which I share with David Fleming. Of course, his whole emphasis of his ecological thinking is that place comes first, and that we human beings are unhappy until we've made a place for ourselves. We don't make it alone, we make it with others, and we make it through bonds of attachment which are not merely economic. On the contrary, they are cultural. The place that we have made here, which we call Scrutopia, we have tried to rescue this old farm and reintegrate it into the local economy. Home is the place where you are in the existential sense. You know, this is where your identity is, where you fixed your being. Because your home is connected with your identity, you feel an immediate bond of responsibility towards it. If you make a mess in your home, you clear it up. You repair it when it starts leaking and falling apart. You're concerned about all its surroundings. We need to learn how to extend that natural feeling, which I call oikophilia, the love of home, beyond the immediate environment of the person to the wider environment. But of course, the wider the environment becomes, the weaker the motive is to protect it. So it follows from this way of looking at things that we must also localize our politics and our sense of environmental fragility. And that's something, again, which David Fleming was so keen to insist upon.
The political economies of the future will be essentially local. They will use locally generated energy and local land and materials, producing for local consumption. This local lean economy will be shaped by a rich, earthy mixture of reciprocities and culture. Localization stands at best at the limits of practical possibility, but it has the decisive argument in its favour that there will be no alternative.
If we think of the problem of our dependence upon the global food distribution network, and this is something which has come about without anybody intending it. It's come about, as Smith would say, by an invisible hand from the opportunities available to supermarkets and from the hidden subsidies that are offered to supermarkets by governments. You know, free roads, a planning permission that permits them to develop these enormous warehouses. Supermarkets are a kind of scam, really. I mean, they're a fully subsidized form of food distribution, which externalizes many of its costs onto future generations without any recompense. And, you know, that they are the enemy. But everybody loves them because they can go to a supermarket and get everything you want. You go back to your hunter-gatherer state of mind, picking things off the shelf. You come away with a smile on your face. So it's a big problem, you know, about motivation. But at a certain point, of course, this distribution network will collapse. But we'd have the alternative, and we've always had the alternative. People grow their own foods spontaneously. Farmers grow food spontaneously. That's what they do. If the food is priced rightly, the farming industry is perfectly sustainable. We here will buy sausages from our neighbour, because not just because those are jolly good sausages, but because this is our neighbour and we really like our neighbour, and it's great to be able to enter into this kind of relation with him. But of course those sausages are a lot more expensive than the ones that we could get from the supermarket down the road. But it's those old-fashioned bonds of attachment which have been threatened by the global economy, and this is where we have to start thinking, okay, how do we bring back that local food economy?
Organic agriculture and permaculture are both intended as imitations of nature. Organic cultivation is the only way by which a community can provide its own food. It doesn't import fertility by the bag. It protects its soil. It's self-reliant.
These are some of the foundation principles taught here at Schumacher College, deep in the English countryside. David Fleming lectured here, and one of his successors today is the anthropologist and activist for local agriculture, Helena Norberg-Hodge.
In our entire history, we grew up connected to the sources of our food, connected in a way that meant that we also understood that food production was and must be at the center of every economy. And the celebrations around the harvest, around the feast of coming together to enjoy the fruits of those labors.
For the harvest of gardens and allotments, for earthy roots, for crackling cabbage, for hanging beans and striped courgette, we give thanks. For the harvest of local hedgerows, for the struggling bramble, the black showers of elderberry, the mushrooms nesting in the dewy grass. For the friends made and support given, for people with whom to laugh and with whom to weep, we give thanks. Blessings on the meal.
I like the egg in the pot. So the idea is to make food as local as possible. So you can't get anything more local than this, because basically all of that is from the field. Chickens have laid these eggs over there. These beetroots, carrots, cucumber, all of that is from what we produced. So we wanted to celebrate harvesting, bounty, and enjoy and eat in the field what was produced in the field.
I think it's very much about improving environmental sustainability and locality of food, and obviously we can grow our food in a very ecological way and try and work as much with nature as possible, rather than relying on larger industrial scale agriculture to feed us. And so I think part of the programme is trying to train up the growers of the future to kind of spread smaller scale local growing to other places.
This kind of lean economy, as David Fleming described it, has also been called the economics of happiness.
For us, the economics of happiness is an invitation to exactly the lean economy, to the local economy that David talks about. And it's the perfect phrase for us because it makes it very clear that at the deepest level, this is about our own well-being. And I believe that today, as people are feeling overwhelmed and depressed, it's incredibly empowering to be able to share a message like David's, that there is a path that we can embark on right now that can, even with the madness surrounding us, start to heal ourselves, our souls, start to help us to connect with life in a way that leads to, that is energizing, inspiring, and hopeful.
In the last decade, Greece has become a telling case study in how to respond to a sudden, devastating economic slowdown. In the years since the crisis hit the country in 2010, economic growth has fallen by 25%. 250,000 companies have collapsed. Unemployment has jumped from 10% to 25% and to over 50% for young people. At its worst, close to half the population of Greece was living below the poverty line. And one response was a movement of just the kind that David Fleming had advocated.
What means for us solidarity is, first of all, to say that no one is alone in this crisis. We are all together, we stay together, we live together, and we fight together. And that is why we have that written here, Mazi. That means Mazi, together, together, in every situation.
And the situation was particularly bad for medical services, as suddenly doctors and hospitals, prescriptions and treatments all had to be paid for. In response, an informal health service was set up by volunteers across the country. Solidarity clinics were established, like this one in Athens, with doctors and pharmacists offering their time and expertise to anyone who needed health care but could no longer afford it. This clinic was founded by the cardiologist Dr. Yorgos Vikas.
It was at the very beginning of the crisis in 2011 that I had the idea of this clinic. The aim was to help patients who simply couldn't afford healthcare and were at the risk of dying. And if I hadn't done anything, I would have felt complicit. When we opened the clinic, we were just 20 volunteers here and 7 of us doctors. And then, within 6 months, we were 300 volunteers and 100 doctors. At first we had a few boxes of drugs. Now we have rooms full coming in as community donations.
Prescriptions are dispensed by pharmacists working in their spare time or by others who are retired.
We see people here who become unemployed because of the crisis or had their pensions cut right back. That's why they come here. So, for example, a person who needs thyroid pills, this pack only costs €1. But even that's something they can afford. So, I rely on this clinic. Otherwise, it would cost me around €100 every month, which I just don't have. It's not a question of charity. This is a political act of solidarity. I retire now, but I can't just stay home watching on television things going on from bad to worse and do nothing. So, I worked here for 6 years now with the other volunteers. We make a team, and I hope we make a difference.
And I can't see all the people die around me, because maybe tomorrow I'll be in the same place. That's why we feel so good, all the people here. That's why, in the clinic. It is very difficult for the people who work and they take a lot of money to understand what is this to give without take back money or something else. They can't understand that. But for us, it is very important, because if there are a lot of places like this, this is the hope of the future.
I go up to the tip very often and see the things that have been thrown away.
You've got a spot weld that's broken there.
I like the fact that these things are repairable, even though the manufacturer doesn't want us to think so. A massive amount of things that can be repaired that don't need to be thrown away, but people would rather buy new things.
Halfway through the material.
Yeah.
Not on one side. I think the Repair Cafe itself goes back right to David Fleming's original thoughts about being able to live in a sustainable world.
Closed-loop systems are systems or communities that have worked out how to reuse most of their materials. For a natural ecology, this is routine, a necessary condition for its existence. Whereas in an open system such as a market economy, this condition is absent. The energy-intensive, materials-intensive, feedback-blind model of society and economy on which we rely is in trouble from many directions. Transition is a wide-awake, small-scale network of resilience towards which talent and passion are being drawn. The tide is flowing.
So following on from David Fleming's original ideas, we've got a movement now which is well established. And I think it's in the everyday implementation of those ideas that you actually get your greatest rewards. Today we had someone who brought in a lamp, and it wasn't particularly easy to repair, but it certainly was something that you wouldn't want to throw away. And it was her mother's suffering with Alzheimer's at the moment.
My mum's 87 and she's been really upset about it for months. And luckily one day I was hoovering and I found that the piece that had been broken off and didn't throw it away. Every night she goes to bed, she says, I miss my little lamp. So she'll be thrilled.
Right, we can pop that.
And what there was a great bond between the person who was fixing and her.
It's very generous community spirit. Thank you, Mark.
That's all right.
It's so kind of you.
That's all right.
So
Glad we
much.
managed to do something.
She'll be thrilled. Thank you.
The Beatles, that is. This one's got a sentimental value in that my father bought it to me and he's died recently. The idea is that you'll have them for a few years and then they'll persuade you, to buy something different. Just throw the old one, but it's not on. You just can't go on like that forever. Or places like here, which I gather are replicated in other parts of the country, once the publicity machine starts moving, I think people would come flocking.
It's just such a good idea rather than things going into landfill. I love it.
I also just want him to hang around here a while and watch people repairing, because he's quite good at that, but I'd like him to be a part of this.
Yes.
My son Chad, he's very good at taking things apart. He's very inquisitive, but he yet doesn't have that ethos of reusing, and he knows how to repurpose, but with a lot of wastage. So I'm bringing him here to help him see that. Like, one small thing is broken on it doesn't mean that it's worthless, that it can still have value and it can still be fixed.
So that's the real, in a way, the economic benefit of repair cafes. You actually get people thinking that, well, we can't go on consuming forever. We can't go on taking raw materials out of the ground and then throwing them away or dumping them in the sea. We've got to be able to express our relationship with the material world in different ways. Here, people have something that they need fixing. They're not necessarily tied to the idea of the transition movement, and yet the fundamental message is, in this world, you can do something about what's wrong with it, I think. You can actually take something, take it and fix it. I mean, the analogy there is it could be the world. You can actually do something about it. So it's got that idea of agency, which is really important. That is, the world is in many ways broken, but you can do something about it.
Suppose I'd like to get a pot. I could nip down to the shop to get one. But the pot would have to get to the shop somehow. And the lorries would need well-maintained roads. which would require more taxes, and that requires more tax collectors and bureaucracy, which requires more people living in towns and larger towns, and they require more food and resources, and as society expands, that means more wealth in the growing society, and this requires a strong military force to defend it. All these intermediate resources are apparently required, when all I wanted was a pot.
David absolutely did not in any way try to ignore or deny the inevitability of collapse. And that made it quite interesting, because sometimes he'd be having a conversation about what needs to happen next. And because I would be thinking about how that would help a transition to a better place, David would be thinking, how will that help us prepare for the post-collapse reality that we're heading towards? And that is quite difficult to deal with, because we're not good at handling collapse scenarios, frankly. It's not really in our psyche to try and think things through the lens of inevitable collapse. And he and I used to have endless rows about all of that, because I didn't then, this is a long time ago, 35 years ago, and I don't now subscribe to a kind of collapse view of the world, but David taught me more about why one doesn't need to subscribe to that view than anybody else from my persuasion, as it were, who somehow continue with lots of illusions hanging around as to what might happen. So I don't know how you'd describe David on the continuum of pessimism to optimism. I think you'd have to put him more in a sort of realism type position around which his own ideas would revolve.
I'd like to read his fairly brief entry on success. And he writes, "Do you really think that we will get through this time and come in due course to a time of resilience, manners, and a harmonic order? Don't answer that question, for you may discover to your cost that the answer is either a self-fulfilling or a self-denying truth, and that both count against us. If we deny that there is a livable future, then we will do little to secure one. If we affirm it, we come into other troubles, such as complacency, an optimistic view that what we are doing now is all that is needed, an iconic focus on the simple solution, or the constant anxiety of life on the edge between hope and doubt. Positive thinking seems to be the right thing in the circumstances until you notice the wreckage. Instead, think of what happened to Orpheus and Eurydice. Eurydice, you may remember, died after having been bitten by a snake, and Orpheus went down into the underworld to recover her. The goddess Persephone agreed to let her go on condition that Orpheus did not look back at her as she followed him. Unfortunately, he forgot about this condition. He did look back, with the result that Eurydice vanished forever, and Orpheus was torn to pieces by angry women who threw his head into the river Hebros, where it floated downstream, still singing. That is, make the intense commitment, at walking pace, plod on. Climb steeply uphill out of the underworld. Keep your eyes fixed ahead. You never know, you might get there. You might even find out where there is, and you might inspire others to come with you. Just don't look back. We do not need to choose between hope and expectation. What matters is to keep hope alive, which we won't succeed in doing if we are constantly checking up on it. It is not certainty that sustains our focus, but the ambiguity that comes to us, for instance, in the prayer from another ancient moment of commitment against the odds. Quote, "Lord, I believe, help thou mine unbelief."
He could see no way forward for our modern economy. The modern, global, neoliberal, market-based economy. He couldn't see how an economy that was permanently fixated with the need for economic growth, not just next year and the year after, but economic growth indefinitely into the future. Let's not turn away from that. There is no conventional political party anywhere in the world that has any interest in trying to think through what we should be doing for humankind that doesn't have economic growth as the underpinning foundation. And that's why he wasn't contemptuous of, but he was always gently wry and dismissive about what I've called in my foreword these halfway houses, these places that people get to kind of escape this logic of collapse. And you look at all these things, and I'm sort of involved in a lot of these efforts to mitigate the worst impacts of today's neoliberal market economy. And David would always say, yeah, no, well, we probably do need to do a bit of mitigation work along the way, but let's not forget where that's going to take us. And indeed, in some cases, he would feel that the more time and effort that we devoted to ameliorating the worst impacts of that economy, mitigating the worst impacts, the less helpful it was in shaping people's views about what needed to happen next. And that, I think, is the more interesting story, what would happen next, because that was where David really began to develop unique ideas about the resilience of different systems, different economies, different countries, different communities, how we could do that if you could not fall back on the expectation of economic growth as the sort of answer to all our problems. And this is, I think, where some of the most astonishing stuff that David did comes into its own, this understanding that there are ways in which we can build the resilience of communities and of whole countries to increase that sense of culture which lies at the heart of all good living together. He absolutely saw that any community, any society, any culture that didn't have conviviality, living well together at its heart, was extremely unlikely to prosper and thrive, even today in a growth economy, let alone tomorrow in a less growth or no growth economy.
He says, actually, it doesn't really matter what our predictions about the future are, because the only path forward in either scenario or in any scenario is based on community and on culture. He says that the only thing that's going to hold together a cohesive society in the absence of the abundance of the growing market is a sense of community integration. And he makes a very strong case that this is actually how society thrived for almost all of human history, that this growth-based market economy has only really been around a couple of hundred years. And that community and culture and what he calls the informal economy, what a lot of people call the gift economy, has been the basis of that throughout history. So it's not that he's invented this brilliant new idea that's going to save us all, but rather that he's saying, you know, we just need to go back to what's always worked. Why David wrote this way is because he had such a holistic way of thinking. You know, he tried to speak about anything and he found it hitched to everything else. And so every talk he would be asked to speak for 20 minutes on such and such, and he would try to say the entirety of this. Because, you know, if you don't understand this, then how are you going to understand what I'm talking about? And so he really is starting from very different premises. And that's why I think a lot of people find it very challenging. He's challenging a lot of the fundamental assumptions of our culture, really. My hope really is that this paperback, Surviving the Future, is a sort of gateway, that people sort of read it and fall in love with David's way of writing and think, oh, wow, now I want more. And then suddenly the great work doesn't seem so daunting. Lean logic finds that when dealing with great matters, it can from time to time be a good thing if there are cracks and faults in the argument, for the repair of which help is invited. It is a reminder that a conversation is a cooperative affair, not just a series of beautifully manicured statements.